Chapter 11, The Cracks, Antony's POV. Antony stomped up toward the deck and told himself it didn't matter that he'd just apologized to his offering. It didn't have to mean anything. Anya was his, and he could do as he pleased with him. Goodness knows the others did. So what if his impulse was to apologize rather than demand a blowjob or issue a punishment? He was still indulging his own whims, and if his whim was different than what he expected, well, that was the nature of a whim, wasn't it? Anyhow, it hadn't been public. What he did in his own damn rooms was his own damn business. His authority had not been undermined. His thoughts were interrupted by a clatter of feet from behind. Antony whipped around, only to see Marcus hurling himself at him with a grin plastered across his face, and the woman from last night stumbling to keep up with him. Her wrists were tightly bound, the end of the rope clutched in Marcus's hand. She'd been moderately cleaned up, at least to the point that one could see her rough, pointed face through the tangle of her hair, and she was wearing an offering's white robe of all things. "Annie, there you are," Marcus cried. The woman barely had time to dig in her heels and keep herself from toppling over when her captor stopped. "I was just about to go surprise Theo at the wheel. Care to come along?" Antony sighed. "Oh, all right." He still rather wished he hadn't allowed this, but it was too late to take his permission back now. He might as well watch the show. As usual, Theodora was indeed stationed at the wheel of the ship. She had her new boy with her and was gesturing to the nearest set of sails and speaking to him in a low tone while he nodded, wide-eyed. Ah yes, the other reason Antony let her keep all her offerings. She trained them to steer and navigate during daylight hours. "Not sure about something, then for goodness sakes ask," she was saying as they drew closer. "I don't care whether you ask me or Hiseo or one of the others, but don't just guess. We won't be annoyed with you no matter how basic the question is or how many times you have to ask it. What matters is that I don't want to stand here and try to explain to these two why they shouldn't brain you after you've run us aground." This last bit was accompanied with a gesture at Marcus and Antony. The boy whipped his head up, then dropped gracefully to the deck in a perfect bow. Hanyu could have taken lessons from him. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Theodora asked, without looking up from the chart she had spread in front of her. Now, lovely Theo, queen of my heart. Is that any way to be when someone comes bearing gifts?" Marcus laughed. She finally looked up, annoyed. Then her annoyance died into confusion as she caught sight of the woman scowling and trembling at the end of Marcus's rope. "What's this?" she demanded. "Why, my darling." Marcus was clearly enjoying the chance to bloviate with the knowledge that, for once, she wouldn't interrupt him. "When we were ashore last night, well, I saw this, and it was so you, I just had to pick it up." "She was in disguise," Antony added, "fighting with the other raiders. She might be dangerous to your other pets, if not to you." "Allow me to alleviate that worry." Marcus spread his arms and glanced meaningfully down at the still, prostrate form of Theodora's new offering. "I'd like to propose a trade, Theo. You obviously don't have any intention of fucking this lovely little morsel as he's meant to be fucked, so why don't I take him off your hands?" Theodora's expression, which had been uncharacteristically open and wanting, slammed shut so fast Antony could almost hear the click. "No." "Come now, Theo, that boy's of no more interest to you than a cold mackerel, and we all know it," Marcus argued, gesturing to the small crowd they'd drawn. "You have half a dozen you can use in exactly the same way you use him. This woman is special. It's been years since we've had one, and it'll be years before we have another." "Kenta's special too." Theodora's voice was firm. "All of my offerings are precious to me, Marcus. Something doesn't have to make my cunt wet to have value, luckily for you." "Right, of course, you like talking with them." Marcus waved a hand dismissively. "But I wonder, who would be more interesting to talk with? A desert fighter who disguised herself as a man to participate in raids? Or some milquetoast hothouse flower pampered in the same temple that's pampered all your other pets for 1,000 years? Antony glanced down at the boy. He'd kept his position perfectly, but Antony could see that the poor thing's whole body was shaking. "Come now, Theo, don't be tiresome." Marcus reached down a hand to grab the boy. Theodora moved to stop him, but Antony moved faster. He had his lover's wrists in a tight grip before he could lay a finger on the trembling form. "Kenta, stand up and get behind me," Theodora ordered grimly, just as Marcus turned furious eyes on Antony. "What the fuck, Antony?" he demanded. "You know the penalty for touching someone else's human without permission," Antony replied coldly. "I didn't feel like tying you to the mast and flogging you raw tonight, so I thought I'd save us both the aggravation." You wouldn't dare, Marcus hissed. Antony wanted to freeze with disbelief, to wonder if he'd misheard a second, but his body was already moving. He grabbed Marcus's other wrist and glared up at the taller vampire. Care to repeat that, War Chief? He asked. He was proud of how icy and calm his voice came out when his brain was still reeling. Marcus glared down at him, and Antony glared right back. This was not a secret apology in his own room. This was public defiance in front of a good third of his crew. Softness might be permissible in the first instance, not this one. Now that he was faced with this, the difference between the two showed stark and clear. I said you wouldn't fucking dare, Marcus snarled, loud enough for everyone to hear it this time. It had been centuries since Marcus had tried to pull this kind of shit. Antony had thought that his lover had, outgrown it? Changed? Not fucking likely. He'd been an idiot to hope otherwise. Antony felt a sudden, deep weariness. This was how it was always going to be, wasn't it? The same fights and clashes, over and over, until the end of time. Please, my lord, I'm sure Marcus didn't mean it. Felix's voice cut in, as cool and professional as if they hadn't all been balls deep in each other just last night. We are all simply wound up from last night's feast. The war chief would never defy you or resist your just punishments, my lord. Antony glanced around. Felix had moved in and placed a hand on his chief's shoulders, his head inclined respectfully in Antony's direction. Theodora was standing with her feet apart and her fists ready, her boy clinging to the back of her shirt like a creeper vine. The 10 or 15 vampires who'd gathered were all glaring at Marcus. There were few crimes to equal going after someone else's human. The crowd was Antony's. Marcus must have read their surroundings similarly, because he relaxed under Antony's hands instead of tearing himself from the smaller vampire's grip, which they both knew he could have done without too much trouble. He dropped his furious gaze, then sank heavily to one knee, pressing a hand to his heart. The woman made a soft, choked noise and bent nearly double as the rope dragged her head down. Forgive me, my lord. It was not my intention to question your authority, Marcus said steadily. Gratifying as his penitence might have been, Antony wasn't fool enough to believe it, nor could he let such a public show of defiance go unpunished. Give me the rope, War Chief, he commanded. I gave you permission to give this captive as a gift, not use her for extortion. Meekly, Marcus surrendered the rope. Antony knew there would be hell to pay for this later, but he took it and tugged gently, drawing the woman closer. Then he held the end of the rope out to Theodora on a flat palm. The boy Kenta flinched and ducked his head behind her shoulder at his movement. She's yours if you want her, Theodora, he said. If not, I'll put her with the rest of the prisoners from the raid. I'll take her. Theodora accepted the rope and inclined her head. Thank you, Lord Antony. Thank you, Marcus. You were kind to think of me. Inwardly, Antony blessed her for doing what she could to smooth over the situation and soothe his war chief's injured pride. Externally, he merely nodded and turned on his heel. It had been a short time to be out of his chambers, but if anyone needed him for the rest of the night, they'd send a servant. He wouldn't rub salt in Marcus's wound by hanging around. More than that, he felt an overwhelming urge to hide away and check to see if either of his siblings had written him back. When he dragged himself through the door, feeling more drained than if he'd been hard at work for a whole night, Hanyu looked up from the bit of carpet he was brushing and grinned, huge and thrilled, before folding clumsily into his bow. Antony felt all the knots in his body loosen. So, there's at least one thing that he hadn't fucked up. Yet. He'd keep it that way if he could. He did his best to let go of all his anger and tension and keep only the weariness. Marcus might be taking the fight out on his offering right now, poor creature, but Theodora wouldn't approve of such behavior, and right now Antony liked Theodora better. He'd do what she would do. He'd try his best to be kind to Hanyu today. If he even remembered how. Hanyu's POV. Lord Antony looked pissed and tired when he came to the door. His obvious sour mood made Hanyu a little nervous, but he was still glad to have an excuse to stop brushing the carpet. How could a person tell when a carpet was properly brushed anyway? My lord? Hanyu hated to bring it up, but it would be worse if he didn't, and Lord Antony saw the washroom before he could explain. I know you said you wanted the washroom to be the way it was when you left, but it's not. I swear you didn't touch the clothes or anything else, but Bunta and some of the other attendants came and emptied the tub and wiped things up, and they took the clothes, and I didn't know if I should let them, but then I thought things might start to smell, and so please don't be angry at me, or Bunta, or anyone really. It's fine, Hanyu. His master really did sound worn out. That's just fine. You didn't do anything wrong. Oh, good. Hanyu smiled into the carpet, relieved. It was good he wasn't in trouble, because he'd forgotten everything he'd been trained to say when he was. He wasn't supposed to chatter and say, "Please don't be angry with me." In fact, the correct line was, "Please punish me for my failure." He'd just have to remember next time. Probably there would be a next time. He lay still as the god stepped past him to the big wooden desk in one corner of the sitting room. He heard a drawer opening, a metallic clanking, and then a heavy sigh from his master. The drawer shut again. "Raise your head," Lord Antony said. When Hanyu sat up and spun to face the god, he saw that his master looked just as unhappy as he sounded. "Are you all right, my lord?" he asked. "Are you all right, my lord?" he asked. Perhaps it was a presumptuous question to ask the god, but what else did one ask when someone looked like that? "Yes, I am." Lord Antony rubbed the back of his neck. "How were you in your music lessons? I could do with a bit of playing. I'm afraid I've only got a flute, a fiddle, and a zither at the moment. Damp ships aren't the best for instruments, I'm afraid. I have to switch them and my books out fairly often. It's a slim selection, but which is your favorite out of those?" Clearly, he was as musical as the priests always said. Hanyu blushed. I'll try, my lord, but I'm not very good at any of those." "I'll be the judge of that. Wait here." Hanyu knelt miserably as the god moved around the chambers, grabbing cases and piling them beside the sofa with careful hands. Finally, Lord Antony settled on the sofa and patted the spot next to him. He was smiling, clearly excited. "Come on, boy. It's a concert, not a funeral. Don't look so dour." "Sorry, my lord." Hanyu dragged himself to the sofa and tried to squeeze up a smile. "Fuck, never mind." The god frowned. "You couldn't fake an expression to save your life, could you?" "Probably not, my lord." Hanyu settled on the sofa. Under any other circumstances, this would feel wonderfully intimate. As it was, he was about to crush all his master's hopes for a pleasant afternoon and show himself to be incompetent at a pursuit the god clearly cared a great deal about. If only he'd known this day would come, he would have worked so much harder at his music lessons if he'd ever dared to dream that he would be Lord Antony's chosen. Damn it, he was going to be thrown out of the bedchamber again for sure. "Let's try the fiddle first," the god urged, handing him the instrument and the bow with almost reverential care. "I could do with something cheerful." Hanyu breathed deeply. So what if he'd never managed it before? He still had the lessons. The knowledge was there. He just never had proper motivation before. Now he had a very powerful motivator sitting across from him on this plush velvet sofa, silver eyes alight with anticipation. Music was clearly the way to win his master's favor, and that was what Hanyu craved more than anything else in the world. He would play as he'd never played before. He exhaled, thought of the perfect jaunty tavern song, and lifted the bow to the strings. Lord Antony's face fell almost as soon as the creaking, squeaking music began. The god quickly rearranged his expression into one of polite interest, but Hanyu had seen his disappointment, and nerves turned all his fingers into thumbs. He barely managed to scrape miserably to the end of the tune. "All right, so the fiddle isn't your best," Lord Antony said, hastily reclaiming his instrument and locking it back in its case. "The zither, then?" The zither went no better. Finally, the god proffered his flute. It was a gorgeous instrument, made of a bright metal and clearly well cared for. Little etchings of some unfamiliar flower circled the flute, almost worn away by the passing of more years than he could even comprehend. Hanyu felt a swell of reluctance to sully the bright, lovely thing with his touch. "This is my favorite," Lord Antony said softly. "I've had it for... it's been almost 1,000 years. Be careful with it." Hanyu felt tears spring to his eyes. "My lord, please, I'm no better with flutes than any other instrument. I'm so sorry to disappoint you, but this will be just as bad as the others." All right. Lord Antony withdrew the flute. "For goodness sakes, boy, there's no reason to blubber over it." I never thought you'd choose me, my lord, not even once. And so when Father Shu said you loved music, I never thought it would matter if I learned it. And I didn't have any talent, so I thought, why bother? And now please punish me for my failure." Hanyu snuffled miserably. He wiped his nose on his sleeve, which elicited a cry of protest from the god. Never mind." Lord Antony sighed. "You didn't fail, boy. You can hardly be expected to be an expert in everything after only 20 years? 21. Well then," Lord Antony looked down at the gleaming flute he still held in his hand. "You know, this is just as well. I don't imagine that listening to music would do nearly as much for my mood as playing it." The god lifted the flute to his lips, then hesitated and lowered it. Feel free to move around the chambers and do as you wish. Just don't make too much noise if you can help it. When his master began to play, Hanyu couldn't have left his place at his side even if he'd wanted to. The flute's tones were high and bright and piercing as a star. Despite his request for cheerful tunes, Lord Antony began playing a song slow and mournful enough to be a dirge, but so beautiful that it brought fresh tears to Hanyu's eyes. And best of all was the god's face as he played. Lord Antony's eyes had slid closed as soon as he began, and if it weren't for the puffing of his cheeks and the more-than-mortal speed with which his elegant fingers flew over the instrument, Hanyu might have thought that he was asleep. As it was, he simply looked peaceful, almost relaxed. Hanyu might have been a failure in every way, the worst offering on the ship or in his master's recent memory, but as the song washed over him, he was still so grateful to be the one who got to see the timeless god, so tense and irascible and weighed down with 100 ancient cares, playing music with the simple pleasure of a child. Probably Asao would find the thought blasphemous.